Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mary Sayers, and I am the CEO of the National Disability Research Partnership. And my pronouns are she, her, and just a bit of a visual description of me. I've got shoulder length, blondie brown hair, I've got clear glasses, got a chain on, I'm a white woman, and very delighted to be here today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting across Australia. I'm here on Bunurong land here in Victoria, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we're meeting today across the country. We know we are on First Nations land and we respect First Nations people from this land. On this land, we live, we work, we play, we swim, and we dream together. First Nations people have lived here for thousands and thousands of years, and now we all share this land. We honour and respect all First Nations people and elders. I want to show my respect to all First Nations people joining us today and recognise the important contributions they make to our community, and our work together in the disability and the research sector. I'd also like to acknowledge our First Nations colleagues and community members who are joining us from Southeast Queensland today. We know that the situation is quite threatening up there, and we also know that First Nations people have cared for the lands in Southeast Queensland for thousands and thousands of years. So we honour and acknowledge you as well. Before we begin, I would just want to mention that today's session, as you know, is being run on Zoom in a meeting format, not in a webinar format. And this means you can see other participants on your screen and you have the option to adjust your settings to suit your preferences. So if you'd like to change your view or pin a speaker, here's how you do that. So there's gallery view versus speaker view. You click on the view button in the top right corner of your screen to switch between speaker view, which highlights the active speaker, and gallery view, which shows multiple participants at one. So if you need to pin a speaker or interpreter, if you want to keep a particular speaker or Auslan interpreter on your screen, hover over their video and click on the three dots which says more, and then there should be more, and select pin the video. If you need any help adjusting your settings, feel free to ask us in the chat. Sue Tape, who will give you a bit of a wave now, is our helper, our troubleshooter extraordinaire today. And so you can either direct message Sue or post your request in the chat. And as part of the NDRP's commitment to role modelling best practices in accessibility and inclusion, we are working really hard to embed accessible ways of working into everything we do, including sessions like this. So please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for others to access, and for you to share with your colleagues as well. If you'd like to turn on captions, if you can't see them, live captions are available for this session. You can turn them on or off by selecting the CC or live transcript button in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. Also, feel free to use the chat and feel free to share your thoughts, but just be mindful of others while you're in the chat. We will also have a 10-minute break during the session if you need to, but also if you need to step away at any time, please feel free to do so. And again, as I said, if you need any additional support during the session, you can privately message Sue Tape from the NDRP in the chat. They're here to help. So I might get my colleague Gillian, who I'll formally introduce very soon, to share the slides, and we'll go to the first slide.
I am on that, yet still find myself doing more clicks than I ever want to on this. 1 second. Somebody do the waiting music, please.
I don't have any jokes at hand, sorry, Jill.
Um, it's coming. It was all lined up and it's just disappeared behind some other windows.
Well, maybe while you were
Great,
getting
got
that,
it.
you've got it. Fantastic.
I
Here you
just
go
want
to
to check that you can't all see mirrored my Zoom windows on this as well, and you can only see the slides. Great. Oh, back to you.
fantastic. So if you can go to the next slide. So just to go through what we'll be covering today, we'll briefly introduce the NDRP, or the National Disability Research Partnership, and highlight our strategic research agenda and guiding principles, and emphasise our commitment to research by and with people with disability. We'll also explain the theme of safety, which and why that was chosen, and also the two types of projects that will be funded in our first round. Then Gillian, who I'll introduce soon, will spend 30 minutes talking us through the funding guidelines, including the expected outcomes, the purpose of possible projects, including what should be covered in a project budget. And she'll also explain to you who you might think about partnering with and what is a lead organisation and who should be on the project team. Sorry, I've lost my place. We'll also discuss the assessment criteria and how to develop a grant application. We'll then take a short break, giving you time to reflect and prepare any questions that you'd like to ask. But you're also welcome to post questions at any time throughout the session. After the break, we'll have an open question and answer session where you can ask about funding processes, the topic focus, or our approach. And questions have also been submitted in advance. Then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways and provide update on future NDRP sessions, and including our drop-ins, and highlight some of the other support options available. We'll also send you an evaluation because we want to learn and always improve on what we're doing, and that'll be shared at the very end, and we really do appreciate your feedback. Okay, next slide, Gillian. So just an overview of the National Disability Research Partnership and what drives our work and how it connects to our first funding round. I'll cover the NDRP strategic agenda, our guiding principles, and the critical role of research by and with people with disability. I'll also explain how round one links to our broader efforts to strengthen research capacity generally. The NDRP has quite a number of goals, and obviously we want to fund research that is aligned to our research agenda. The research agenda was developed over many, many years by the NDRP Working Party that helped establish the NDRP. Including what is important to people with disability. So this was done in deep consultation and engagement with the disability sector and people with disability. We'll also work to strengthen disability research capacity. And our role is not limited to just funding the research. Our role is to really work with the disability community, with the research community, with government, to really think and develop in terms of that disability-led research. We'll obviously make sure evidence research is done by and with people with disability. And then the other key part of our work, and you'll hear this a lot from us, is we'll mobilise evidence for action to influence policy and practice. The type of research we want to fund is that's going to make the biggest difference to change policy and practice to improve the lives of people with disability. So I'll get you to go to the next slide. Our work is also underpinned by the NDRP guiding principles, again, which were developed by the Working Party. And there's four themes of these guiding principles, plus there's some sub-themes that come under that. But I'll just go through the high-level guiding principles. Obviously, and I spoke just before, advancing high-quality research that informs disability policy and practice in Australia. Valuing the knowledge of people with disability in research. As I mentioned before, strengthening that disability research capacity and making sure we're sharing research findings widely in useful and accessible ways to the whole community and to those other end users of disability research. So I'll then now go into the research agenda. So I'll go to the next slide, please, Jill. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was a long process by the Working Party to really understand what types of research the disability community wants. And you'll see there that there are 12 research areas. And so one of the key important things that the NDRP considered was, how do we actually prioritise and choose what our first funding round is about? And the board and team went through a process of looking at what research is most pertinent at this time. And they chose the topic of safety of people with disability. And we did this because there are evidence gaps. And we did this because there's a significant policy imperative following the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse and Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. But we also know that it's of high interest to government, both Australian and states and territories. And we also know that the safety of people with disability goes across systems. So it's not only about safety within the NDIS, but it covers education, housing, all institutional settings, and non-institutional settings, including the community. So safety includes emotional, psychological, cultural, and digital safety alongside physical safety. And research projects in this area will address those systemic barriers, not just individual experiences, whilst they are crucially important as well. So as we decided how we're going to progress with this research funding round, and I'll go to the next slide. Sorry, Jill. We decided on this topic of safety that there should be two funding rounds, not just one. And there was a very deliberate reason we did this. We wanted to fund in our first round the things that often don't get funded in traditional research. And that is the co-design approach and the co-production approach. And so we have two streams of research funding, which I'll talk about in this first round. And in the second round later in the year, we'll open up larger research funding on the topic of safety of people with disability. So I'll get you to go to the next slide, Jill. So round one, hopefully you will all have seen that we've published a whole range of guidance, which Jill will talk about in detail very soon. But the forms will open on the 17th of March to actually start applying and close on the 28th of April. And projects will start in June, July and go for around 6 to 10 months, with the aim of having them finished before May next year. I'll go to the next slide, Jill. And on the topic of safety of people with disability for round one, all projects will use co-design approaches. So there'll be two streams, which we'll deep dive into very soon. Co-design of research proposals to use in an application for future research funding, which may be the NDRP or it may be other sources of funding, including other research schemes, philanthropy, government and the like. The second stream is using knowledge synthesis, because we know on the topic of safety of people with disability, we're not starting with a blank slate. There is evidence out there, even though there's evidence gaps. And this second stream will use knowledge synthesis methods to bring together what's already known about a topic and co-produce reports, briefs, or guidelines or similar, so that action can be taken more rapidly. So having a deeper understanding of what the current state of evidence is around different elements of safety of people with disability. And we know it's a very broad area. So, funding in round one is grounded in the research agenda. And for this round, um, there'll be small scale projects to provide an entry point for new collaborations or innovative methods. And these projects are ideal for testing ideas that may later scale up. Larger scale projects, which may be funded later, address structural and policy level changes and creating that systemic impact. And so these projects will embed co-design principles to ensure research is led by people with disability and directly address their priorities. We want to see projects that demonstrate not just the what, but the how, showing inclusive methods in action. I think this might be a good time to hand over to you, Jill, if that's okay, as we start going through the key documents. But I'd like to introduce my lovely colleague, Jill, who is the head of our research program, who will share her insights today. And Gillian is a very passionate advocate and thought leader. And at the heart of Gillian's work is a commitment to collaboration and co-design, ensuring that people with disability are not just participants, but leaders in shaping research to drive meaningful change. Her dedication to fostering inclusive practices and empowering diverse voices has been instrumental, I would say, in advancing the principles that we stand for. So Gillian will guide us through what information is available and then start going into a deep dive. So over to you, Jill.
Jill speaking. Thanks so much, Mary. I am a white woman. I've got hair that's longer than usual because I haven't got around to getting it cut. It's like a light brown color, wearing a green shirt, and I have glasses on. I just want to say that that's always very embarrassing. And in my commitment to being a neurodivergent person who doesn't mask, embarrassing too long, and I'm going to try and give you the information you need and allow myself to be a silly goose from time to time as we go through. So I think we're talking about really serious subject matter, and also what a privilege it is to work with this organisation that's been informed by so much knowledge and so much wisdom and experience. What we're wanting to do is create environments where people can work together and feel comfortable to be themselves. We want research teams to form, having all sorts of different people involved who include people who come from academia, but aren't limited to, and aren't necessarily controlled by the academic ways of doing and knowing, but that's something that adds to a process of working together in co-design. So any time where I'm not sounding very formal or serious shouldn't reflect the fact that I feel like this is very important and serious work that we're doing together, but we should do it in ways that feels comfortable. Mary's covered the topic of safety. I should say too, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm coming from the unceded lands of the Awabakal and Worimi people at the moment. That's where I live and work. And I want to acknowledge and make sure that we also tap into the ancient wisdom and experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And communities, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, have been co-designing and have been researching in community-led ways for tens of thousands of years. So everything we do needs to draw from and learn from that. So this grant round, we have prepared some documentation that is going to guide you through the process of thinking about your projects, developing an application and putting an application in. They're available to you in a few different ways. So we're aiming to make the information as accessible and easy to go through as possible, noting that research applications just aren't a simple thing. So just because we've got them available in several different ways doesn't mean that you'll automatically find it easy. And please get in touch with us if you can't find something that you're looking for, or if you need something presented in a different way to allow you to access them. As a summary of what's available, we've got an overview document. It's available in the really detailed version for people like me who want every single piece of context before we can get started with something. Then there's a plain language version of the overview document as well. There's an Auslan version and an easy read version. And I'll go into in the next slide what's in each document, right? But there's an overview document, and there is a document available in those 4 different formats called the grant guidelines. And for anyone who's done heaps of research before, please bear with me just for a moment, but I wanted to make it really obvious about what the different pieces of information you need to know about for any grant funding round. Just wanted to make it obvious to everyone. So the second piece, the grant guidelines, takes you through exactly what we're looking for these projects. And it has a bunch of assessment criteria in there as well. And we'll go through that in detail. So the assessment criteria means basically how your application will be reviewed, assessed, and then given a score when we're deciding whose projects to fund. The third thing on this slide now is a screenshot of the form. To apply, there's an online form. We're using a platform called Smarty Grants, and it's not open yet. I'm going to ask Sue to put in the chat the dates for when it's opening. I think it's the 17th of March, but remembering dates off the top of my head is tricky. The form will be open, and there'll be a bit more guidance about how to use it available at that time too. Thanks, it is the 17th of March. There's also information everywhere. There's also more information on our website, including frequently asked questions and more questions that get asked today. Please ask them, even if you think it's kind of already covered. As you ask questions, and frequently, we will add them to the list of frequently asked questions on the website. There's also a policy on the website as well, which gives you a bit more of that detailed information about how our research funding program is governed and how we'll make decisions about which projects to fund. So we'll go through these documents now. I can't see the chat at the moment, but feel free as you're thinking of something to already start to use it. And when we get to the Q&A later, you're very welcome to turn your camera on and just ask the question or to type it in the chat and we'll address it. Okay, so which document? We'll start with this grant funding overview, and it's talking about, it's an overview of all of the stuff you'd need to know for both grant rounds for this year. Again, they're all on our website. So what's in it? It goes through in a bit more detail about the topic, and Mary's kind of already covered what we mean by safety, that it's very broad. The thing to know here is that projects that we fund this year, they really need to be, they need to have safety as kind of the main point, rather than safety as maybe a secondary outcome that you would be looking at. So they're projects that really will work towards advancing safety for people with disability. There's more information on the research agenda and the principles in there. It outlines the 2 funding rounds that Mary's already gone through and the type of research we fund and support, which Mary's already gone through. So it's a reminder on research that is done in ways that aligns with our principles, and also research for this year's funding needs to all, regardless of what it is, use co-design approaches. What else is in the overview? And I'm just grabbing the paper document now too, so that I have the details in front of me. It's going to go into who can apply for funding, and I'd like to just go through that now to make it really clear. There will be some teams and groups that already exist where people who work in academia, academically qualified researchers or professional researchers already working well with community organisations, disability representative organisations. So in some cases, I'm not going to go on too much of a tangent actually. What I want to say is that we'll support and fund university-led projects or community organisation-led projects. So determining who should be your project lead is a personal question. And it's a question as to what will work best for the project that you're proposing and in the context you're working with. But it doesn't have to be a university who is the lead organisation who receives the funding. It absolutely can be. Projects absolutely can be led by academic researchers. We want to encourage that. We also at the NDRP want to encourage career opportunities and put resources and run some programs that make it easier for people with disability to have a career as a researcher. But that's not the only kind of research we fund. So if you're a disability representative organisation or another kind of organisation that provides services or works in other ways with people with disability, you also could lead a project and apply for funding. Once we have funded projects, we're not going to just leave you to it and ask for a report at the other end. But everyone who receives funding, you'll be supported, which, as an add-on thing, but also somewhat obliged to get involved in something that will look like a community of practice with extra bits. So we want to provide you with support. We want to make sure that people working as part of research teams have access to some upskilling, have access to different forums where you can learn from each other, connect with each other, or also have some help to make connections that you can see are important. If you're looking for more access to people working in a policy area that's relevant, for example, within our community that we form and support, we want to help you make that connection. So it's kind of an extra thing, and not just funding that people whose grants are funded will receive, but also active support. Also in this document is more information about how we choose the projects to fund. I think I'll give the details with regards to that later if we have time, and rather focus on what's in the next what's in the next documents, which is the grant guidelines. Right. At any time, and I can only see some of you, it's really nice, those of you who are smiling and nodding, or screwing up your face if I've said something weird. But again, feel free just to pop questions in the chat or turn your cameras on if you want to. No pressure. I don't mind a camera off moment myself. Okay, second important document. They're all important, but if you're preparing a grant application, always have a look, study the grant guidelines. So this is a really important document. It's available in a few different formats like we discussed, and it covers both, the program goals. And by program goals, I mean the goals for the NDRP in us giving this money out to different projects, what our overall goals are. So we're not just looking to fund individual projects that would on their own make a great impact. We're looking to fund projects that actually together as a program of work have the biggest collective impact. There's a bit more information about what we're thinking and what we're looking for in the grant guideline. And it's got the juicy details you need. So it's got budget information, what you can and can't use the money for, the timeframes, eligibility. And so by eligibility, it means who's allowed to apply for a grant and who, in this case, is not allowed to, the deliverables for these short projects, and then we'll cover who can be on the team, who can lead projects, and who can be partners in the assessment criteria. Now, I'm also just looking at the time because at some point we will need a break, and keeping track of time without a clock is not my forte. I'm going to actually just address a question that's come up in the chat before I go on to the next slide, because I think this might help with, as you're thinking through how this advice and how this description of the guidelines applies to you. Organisations can apply for more than one grant. So there's 2 streams, and also you potentially could put applications into for a couple of projects within each stream. The key thing here is that a project lead can only be a project lead on one project per stream. And further than that, when we're assessing the grants, making decisions, you also should be thinking about making sure it would be feasible for you to do what you're proposing to do. So if you've applied as an organisation for 6 or 7 different things and they all just happen to be fantastic for funding, but it just absolutely isn't possible for that much work to happen, then it's unlikely that they would all get funded. So yes, you can apply for several, but as project lead, you can only lead one project per stream. Have I forgotten anything else important about that particular point, Mary? Because I think it's an important one.
No, that's good. And you've got 15 minutes left, Jill, just to give you an indication of how you're going for time. I'll put my
Great.
camera
Thank you.
back on when we're getting close.
Okay, perfect. So coming up next, I'll go into the budget information, a bit practical, and then come back to more about the assessment criteria. Oh, before I get there, just kind of a reminder and any clarification that's needed. 1 bucket of money for this first round. The projects need to take between 6 to 10 months. So my first reaction, and the first reaction of many people as we've been developing these guidelines, was 6 months is not very long to do very much. When we understand this, we want people to propose projects that are feasible and that can be done within that time frame, knowing you've got up to 10 months. So design something and propose something that's possible with a bit of a contingency there. I wouldn't be proposing something that will, at its shortest, take 10 months, because if anything happens and slows things down, that wouldn't be feasible. But for the first stream, thinking about the timeframes as well, we're not asking for you to co-design every single little detail about a project that you then might run with future funding. We're asking for a proposal that covers what you think you can co-design that would help you be competitive for funding in a round that would follow that, if that makes sense. In some context, that might look like you get heaps of stuff done and you make a whole lot of progress. You might already have existing relationships, or there might be something and you can say we would get this much work done. In other contexts, that might look like it takes a lot longer to make less progress compared to another project perhaps, but you should propose something that is going to make an impact, that's feasible to do in the time, in the context you're in, with the people you're working with, if that makes sense. So that's stream 1, co-designing a research proposal you then could use in an application for funding in a future round. Stream 2, and using some knowledge synthesis methods. And that might look like rapid reviews or other kind of review methods and synthesis methods where you're bringing together what's already known about a topic. You need to have time to co-produce a report or a brief or a guideline in an accessible format, and a format that's accessible to the people who need that knowledge. So these aren't humongous projects. They're smaller projects that we hope will have a big impact. So then how can you spend the money? Absolutely, you can spend it on wages. Wages might be paid to people with disability who are engaged as co-designers. They absolutely may be in a paid role where you're paying wages. Could engage people in a contracting situation. You can also use them for honoraria or other kinds of payments that aren't wages, depending on what's going to work best to be more appropriate for the people in your team. If you need to bring people together to work in person, absolutely, you can put in your project budget that you're covering travel, accommodation, hosting costs for reasonable hospitality. I think it is very important to cater well and appropriately to groups that you bring together. We'll be considering kind of value for money in the deliberations as well. So don't do something too fancy. But in the methods section, absolutely explain why you need this money to facilitate something that's appropriate for the people you're working with, that facilitates the work you need to do. And you can use the money to, we'd love you to use the money, please, to support inclusive participation where that's needed, so that you're designing something that's inclusive, that's accessible to everyone involved. And we know that stuff costs a lot of money. So again, when expecting you to do work that has a great, huge impact, but I wouldn't be proposing something that is unachievable because you've planned to do way too much. All right, I think that's pretty clear. If you've got any more questions about what things can be covered, can't be, ask them. Yeah, if you also really think that some members of your team or all members of the team would need to do training to make your project more successful, more safe, more accessible, that can be considered as well. What you can't cover, you can't buy big expensive stuff that's not really needed for the project. It's a good idea to have a look at what already exists among the partner organisations who you're working with. Where it says purchase of major equipment, please do ask us if you're not sure if there's a piece of equipment that's required for providing access to someone, and there's an absolute reason why that's required. Please ask us, but you can't buy cars. You can't buy computers that are beyond what's required for the project with the funding. And absolutely, we don't want to have a situation where an organisation is funded to do the work and that organisation just subcontracts most of the work out to someone else. Those people, if they've got the skills and should be involved in the project, could be part of your project team instead, and then you're all working together. All right. Oh, this is on the timeline. On this slide is a picture with lots of parts to it. It's essentially covering the fact that when the form opens, the application form on the 17th of March, it's open for 6 weeks. So it closes on the 28th of April. You don't have to wait till the form opens to start planning your projects and developing things, but you've got 6 weeks from form open to form close. And then projects must start in June or July this year. So again, in thinking of something to propose, if it's something that needs a longer lead time to get started, then it's not for this funding round. So something that could start in June or July and that would be completed in May next year or earlier. I'm not doing the assessments. That will be other people. But a tip would be propose something that you're sure is feasible to get done in that time and explain why you know it would take that long. This is a plain text version of the things that I've just said. And just briefly, on how applications are going to be assessed and scored and who's doing what. And Marianne too, I can see that you've got your hand up. So just, I'm sure Sue's also on that as well for when we get to the question asking part. We are going to engage independent panels. So those are people who aren't staff or who aren't on our governance committees to be involved in looking through the applications and doing an assessment, giving them a score. Then there's a governance committee called our research committee. Those people then will look at the highest scored projects and then decide together which projects together as a program of work are most likely to have the kind of impact that we're looking for. And our board will make the final decisions about who gets funded. So our aim is to have a transparent, rigorous process that's also inclusive. It won't just be academic researchers assessing the applications, and there's more information about who will be involved. It should be that there's enough different perspectives on the in the thinking about which projects to fund and how they will land in real life, and there's more information in the funding policy.
Mary speaking. Jill, I'm just giving you a little bit of a time warning. We've got about 7 minutes left. So, and I can also see there's people with hands up. We'd really love to get through the content of what Jill's presenting because it may answer some questions, and then we'll come to you with your hands up in the Q&A session after the break. So we think hopefully the next few slides might answer some questions, but if they don't, then we'll absolutely love to come to you in the Q&A session. So back over to you, Jill.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And there's only 2 slides to go as well. I also am the kind of person who wants to say my question as soon as it comes to mind so I don't forget it. So who can be on your project team? So we talked at the start about we need an organisation to be a lead organisation. It can be any kind of organisation, with the caveat that the organisation who's going to be the lead really should be an organisation that has in place the kinds of policies, procedures, and financial management systems that would allow them to be able to receive the money, manage the project, and support people with any credentialing or insurances and things like that that are needed. So technically any organisation, but just think about also, is the organisation one that would be trusted by the communities who you're proposing to work with as well? And are they set up in a way that they can receive the funding, manage the project? Then there's one person who's the project lead. That person can be someone who works with the lead organisation, but doesn't have to be. So that's an important point. They should be someone, though, who is trusted by all members of the team, nominated by the lead organisation, and has the skills. And by the skills, I mean both the leadership skills as well as the practical skills that they would need to have that leadership role. So that might look like a role where they're managing the project, but it doesn't have to be. The project leader could be leading and doing other things, not the day-to-day project management, but certainly it needs to look like a leadership role and be someone who has skills and experience as a leader. If they're a more junior person, that's wonderful if they're supported well by other people in the team. So this is not only for the most experienced researchers or program leaders that are out there. It also could be very appropriate for someone who's more junior. We had a question the other day saying, could a PhD student lead a project? Absolutely, they could. There's no reason why they can't be eligible. And we understand too, some PhD students might have 15, 20 years of experience in a policy role in another organisation, or they might have lots of experience leading communities, be very well trusted by communities, and have a track record that shows they can lead projects like are being proposed. In the team, there should be other people who have any academic skills and experience that's required to make the project a success. So if you're proposing a knowledge synthesis project, you want to have team members who have great experience in doing rapid reviews or leading the kind of work that's being proposed. You can pick your team however you think is going to work best. Be a bit strategic about it and explain in the application why you've allocated the different people in the team the roles that you've allocated them. The last thing I really want to say about the team is that there's not one size that the team has to be. You have to show us that you're working in partnerships, though. So a team of one person, you're not eligible. A team where it's just people from one organisation is also not eligible. But beyond that, it might make sense to be a very small team for the work you want to do, or it might make more sense to have a few different partners or people who have different types of experience and roles to make your project work. So in the time frame that you have, it's probably not a good idea to have a cast of thousands, but there isn't a set number that you have to have. All right, that's all on project team members for now. And I was going to go into a bit more detail about some of the assessment criteria, but I am thinking that going through some of this stuff in the questions is a better idea. I can't stress enough how important it is, though, to go through the criteria. And I'll give you just that kind of high-level steer on what each of them means, because it's against the criteria that your application is assessed. So it's essential. And by the way, in the criteria and on the slide, in the guidelines, and on the slide, we're telling you how much each of those criteria, which basically it's some questions and then you have to answer them in the application form. Your answer to the first one, for example, is worth 25% of the whole score. So it's very much like a marking criteria if you're doing an exam. It's really important and worth a quarter of your score to make a very clear case for why the project that you're proposing is going to have a big impact on policy or practice or programs that will lead to people with disability, in the group of people with disability who you're talking about, having access to a safer life. So that's really important. Have to make a clear link for us on how this thing, do you understand the policy environment? Are you thinking about the human rights frameworks that are relevant? And will your project have this big impact? The second one that's also about impact is more about the project's process. So you know that if you do things in certain ways, you could have a positive or a negative impact on communities or organizations or the people you're working with. And we want to know how your project is going to lead to perhaps a better capacity for doing disability inclusive research in the future, or other things. And we can have a look more at the points that are in the assessment criteria, but just by doing the project, what impact will that have? The project methods section is where you write what you're going to do, with who and how. A tip there is please say what you mean. I know that I've got minus 30 seconds left. As if I put my hat on as being someone who's reading and assessing grants, it's so much easier to understand what's meant if you use some plain language here. So you'll need to use the language if you're proposing to do a certain type of a review. You'll need to talk about the research. If you're doing a certain type of co-design or engagement, there'll be cultural language which is relevant. So you would need to use that language, but just explain what you mean. Where people write, we're going to engage with this community and we're going to run a workshop, and that's all they write, the reviewers don't know what you mean. It's very vague. That doesn't actually really explain what it is you're going to do and why you're choosing those methods. That's on the project methods. Just try and make it really clear what you're going to do, with who, how, and why. And then the last section that's scored is an explanation of why you've picked your team, basically. Why that leader is the leader, and then what skills and experience the other people bring to the roles that you're going to give them. They're all the bits that are scored. And then the last criteria helps our research committee to make those final decisions about overall value that your project would add to our investment in this research and our collective vision to create a safer life for people who live in Australia with disability, and that you've understood the risks. That's the overview.
Thank you very much, Jill. It's Mary speaking. We are going to go to a break now. In the room, in the virtual Zoom room, we've got Marianne who had a question and Claire who had a question. In terms of some of the other themes of questions that are asked, I've seen quite a few questions in the chat about ethics, so we can focus on our answers around the ethics process, and also about the independent review process. So we can start off with those types of questions, and then that might spur more questions. But in the break, we'll take 10 minutes. We'll be coming back in 10 minutes from now, and I'm in Victoria, and we'll turn my camera off back on when we're about to get started. So thanks everyone. Hope you can have a break, cup of tea, or think about some really great questions for us. So thank you very much. We won't be. All right, Mary speaking. We'll get started with our Q&A. And thank you everyone who has put questions in the chat, or who would like to ask a question. And we'll open it up once we've gone through the first few questions for even more questions. The first question Moretta had about would safety cover things like natural disasters and emergencies, and I think that question was answered in the chat. So I'll now take you to the second question that came before the hands up question, and I'll just get that one up, which was from Rachel. And the question was, will co-design projects that focus on capacity building of the teams and coming up with future project ideas require ethics approval? So over to you, Gillian, to answer that one.
Thank you. This is such an important question, and it's such a difficult question. Yeah, it's kind of really important. In the overview document too, on page 9, I'm giving you a bit of guidance, and there's one thing that says, when do I need to get an ethics approval? And I'm going to try and give you some guidance and probably disappoint you with a little bit of a politician-like answer, because it really does depend. So it depends on the types of methods that you're going to use in your project and the context of the research, and also who is in the team and who's working together on it. So projects at the really early stage, the early phase, where you're co-designing something that definitely will need ethics approval later, if everyone on the project team are the people who are all co-designing together, who are going to be co-authors on papers produced. You know, it might be a situation where it doesn't count as it doesn't meet the definition of research. I don't want you to just take my word for it though, because it really does depend on your context as well. So it might be the case that something you're proposing, especially if you're not collecting any new data from people, you're not working with communities you don't have existing relationships with before, and people who aren't members of your project team, or working with organizations who know things and have existing knowledge that they've collected from members, or have existing processes where they get together with their members and there's not a researcher going and interviewing and collecting data from people. It might be that it either doesn't meet the definition of research, or you're eligible for an exemption, or there's a low risk pathway. So we would encourage you, if you're not sure, to go and talk to an ethics committee. That might be an ethics committee at a university. It might be a community or an organizational ethics committee. Some universities have now different research governance and research ethics bodies where it's advice giving first that's available before you need to put an application in. So yes and no. If it turns out that what you get together and you start to think about really is something where you think the way to do this best is to collect some more data, and is to run focus groups, and is to do surveys and those kinds of things, where you think actually what I need to do is research in order to design my research, then perhaps you might need to use a co-design grant or another grant to do that preparatory work. And the next bit that you're proposing, which is the collection of new data, that's the next thing. So that's kind of an answer and a non-answer. Depends on the communities you're working with and the context. Please get some advice. Some things, if you're set up, you have existing relationships, you're all members of the team working as equals, even if your roles aren't such that you all do the same amount of work, but if there's equal power sharing, you know, maybe there's less of a long protracted process that is required to make sure that you're working in ethical ways. Because just remember, regardless of whether you need a formal ethics approval or not, you're always required to do research in ethical ways. And that's different to having an ethics approval. That's process never supposed to be a tick box. I'm on a soapbox here, Mary, I can tell. It's not just, ethics doesn't just mean the ethics approval. You always need to work ethically. And the answer is, it depends.
Speaking, I just wanted to add to that question. You will have seen in the guidelines that a requirement is that you have people with disability on your project team. So you don't need to get ethics approval to have people on your project team with disability. And in fact, we actively encourage that. So if you've got people with disability, people who have lived experience of the issue that your project is about, they're an equal member of your team. So I hope that that's clear as well. And the other thing too is you don't need to get ethics approval before you put your funding application in. So I'm assuming that's obvious. The next question in order was Mary Ann. And are you still there, Mary Ann? Have we answered your question, or would you like to answer your question, ask your question?
My question, good afternoon. My question is, if you do get the first funding round and you're working, like, you've got, you do your first funding round, can you continue the same project in the second funding round? So it's, because you might not be able to, you might get up to your 10 months or whatever, but you want to expand that project. Can you do it that way?
Marianne, that's a terrific question. We've got a very good answer for that. So, Gillian, I'll hand over to you. The question was, if you have a project that you've had funded in round one, can the second stage or the next stage of that be considered for funding? So, Jill?
Yeah, Jill speaking, absolutely. On the one hand, we hope that projects funded in the first round, some of those will be able to fund that development work and co-design work, or understand what evidence there already is that exists on this and where gaps are, And then the results of those projects could be used to make your application much stronger into the second round. You'll notice that the timelines, though, it's not as if you have a chance to completely finish the first project, which might matter or it might not matter. So it's not the case that you would need to have delivered your report to us and have everything completely tied off before you could use what you've learned or use some of the results from the work that you're already doing to inform an application into the second round. Also, if your project takes longer, we will run other rounds, and it's a completely valid outcome if we're funding co-design of your project. If you think that there's a different funding scheme which is a better fit for the thing you're designing than our second round, absolutely, that's a good outcome, is you've been able to use our funding to strengthen capacity, develop relationships, and develop something that you're likely to get funded from somewhere else. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marianne, for that question. The next question was a question in the chat before I come to you, Claire, with your question. So Megan in the chat said, what is the background of the independent panels? As we know, there are some topics and disability groups who are less understood or more often excluded by people without disability experience. So, Jill, and I'm hoping you can answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. Again, great questions. The panels, completely full transparency, they are not assembled yet because we don't yet have everyone's applications to know what is the best, who are the best people to invite to be on the panels. But in every case, they will include people who have appropriate research expertise in the types of methods that are in groups of projects, that will have lived experience that's relevant to the topic. Of course, it won't be possible in every case to make sure that there's people with disability from the very specific group of people that every single project directly impacts, but there will always be people with disability as co-designer representatives on panels, as well as people from policy or industry where it makes sense. So we want to have a diverse, and I get a bit uncomfortable when I use that word, because what does that mean? Often it means it will include people who are different to the people who are usually included. But actually a panel of people who have different perspectives and experience and are going to know what the impact of the proposed projects is likely to be from different angles, from how it lands with communities and people with disability, how it lands for policymakers, how it lands for practitioners. So different types of people on the panels, but we haven't selected them yet because we don't know exactly what's needed. Can say that for projects where they are with and by people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander communities, that there will be Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people on those panels assessing those applications.
Okay, all right.
I was just thinking, I know you've got a second question, but kind of just to wrap up the thing about who can be on teams.
Yeah.
There's no maximum number of applications a person could be a team member on.
Yeah.
So you still could be playing a leadership role in a different project in the same stream, but not nominated as the project leader. Noting that I'm fairly sure, I'm speaking for them now, I'm fairly sure the research committee won't be funding people to do work they don't have capacity to do.
Yeah.
So if someone's involved in 17 projects, and it does make sense that they could do all that work.
Yeah. 100%. All right, sweet. Thank you for that. That's good to know. Second thing is just to touch on the concept of representation that you're talking about in the assessment committees. Just wanted to flag the rural flag a little bit, in that a quarter of our population live rurally. And I think that it's really important that we have people assessing these applications that have a good understanding of how things work in rural practice, because obviously things that can be quite metrocentric. Half the reasons we have non-functioning access to resources in rural areas is because the policies are metrocentric in nature. So I think that these NDRP represents an opportunity for us to move away from that and really make sure that things are seen in a slightly different way going forward. I just wanted to say that while I had the chance. But so yeah, not so much of a question, but just is there a chance that that kind of representation, because it does represent quite a large proportion of our community, like, yeah, I know it's hard to find the balance in committees. Is something like a rural representation a possibility for the assessment committees?
And Mary speaking. We're still going through the process, Claire, so I can't give you a definitive answer yet.
Yeah.
What I can say is we will be putting more information about the assessment criteria. We'll be making that, the assessment matrix. Sorry if I've got that on the website as well.
Yeah.
Coinciding with the release of the opening of the forms.
Yeah.
But also to say that, and this is why that project impact has 25% of the weighting, because, you know, in the case of a project that's with and by people with disability about rural areas, that's a really important thing to emphasise that impact and how it's going to impact on that community or communities. So sorry not to be able to give you a definitive answer, but we really want to be transparent about what we can answer and what we can't. And also, if we can't answer it today, there are things we're thinking about for answering on our FAQs as well. So if it's okay, I might move on to the next question, Claire.
Thank you so much.
Jenny's got a really fantastic question, thank you, and I'm going to read it out, but we might need to put it in the chat as well, Sue, because it's quite a long one. Can budget be allocated to preparation of application for people with disability? Preparation of the application. I understand why that's usually not included for organisations' unis. However, these costs are absorbed by entire organisational budgets. When individual people contribute to these types of application, it comes directly from our mortgages. It is intended as an equitable funding decision, but is a significant social economic barrier to participation at the design stage of the research and contributes to the already biased research agenda. So, Gillian, I'll hand that one over to you, but I think we've got an answer for that one.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for just being frank and fearless with your questions as well, because it's all information that helps us to try and keep doing what we need to do. There's no defensiveness intended in any of our answers. I was just a bit conscious of that too. It's like, yes, we planned for that, but we're always thinking about how to do it better. I think that you're talking about, can you spend your budget to reimburse people who were involved in developing the application? And is that what you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I don't think I have that answer right now. I think we have to go and have a conversation about that. Definitely the co-design stream is so that people with disability can be involved in the development, essentially, of what you need to put into a grant application for a larger round. So we're absolutely covering for that in terms of moving forward. I hear what you're saying, and I know how this plays out. And I think in this grant round, we've tried to balance having an easy and low touch as possible grant application, knowing that it's still a grant application, actually still takes quite a lot of work. There's another question in the chat that's asking about, there's a small word limit on the questions, and that can disadvantage people, for example, neurodivergent people who want to use and need to use more words to get the same thing out. We may absolutely not have got this right this time, but we actually have included a larger word limit than we wanted. We've tried to think about how can we balance making this easy and making it so that people don't have to write a massive essay if that's really not accessible or even necessary for them. But we extended the word limit deliberately to try and kind of find a middle ground. I hear what you're saying, and I don't think I've answered that next question for you really, except to say, noted. Absolutely, it's valid, and I don't know whether funds can be used to reimburse work that's already been done, but I think we should take that away and discuss it, Mary.
Mary speaking, and the way I interpreted that question, again, shows my neurodivergent brain as well, is I interpreted that question, and maybe I've got it wrong, Jenny, in that can it be used for the next funding round? So obviously we're co-designing research proposals. So that it can be used for future funding rounds. So I had interpreted that slightly different with my brain as well. So yeah, so I think that's the intended purpose of this co-design round, is so you can get ready for the next stage. Yeah, so and do the work that's never funded in terms of the design and thinking about what might be needed in the future. So that's how I interpret it, but I've probably got that wrong as well. So
It sort of is, but I've been involved in multiple grant applications, and I regularly sit there with everyone else in the room from organisations are paid for the preparation, and I'm not. And often, or the last couple, the proposal for the ideas, the proposal for how to structure it, the proposal for what the outcomes are all mine. And everybody else is paid to prepare it, whether the grant goes ahead or not. So if we're talking about research agendas, which is encouraging input from people with disabilities, and we're the only ones in the room who are not paid, there's something wrong with it.
Jill speaking, Jenny, I absolutely agree with you. And I think what we've done here is we've made that problem smaller, but we haven't removed it, right? You still need to develop an application to this grant round. It's kind of a bit meta. But the first stream of this grant round makes sure that people with disability are paid for the significant work of really co-designing and doing that grant development work that's usually not paid. You haven't completely removed the problem at the start. Some organisations I've worked with, though, including universities and research institutes at the past, have worked out ways to have discretionary budget to be able to support and pay people. That I know that that's not always available, but at this stage, encourage anyone who's working with people with disability or other co-designers who can't be paid and wouldn't have access to the program, if there's a way to support them, I would also advocate with you for that. And I think we haven't solved the whole problem, but hopefully we've solved some of it this round for some people.
It's a good step forward. I'd also like to point out that, sorry, but Coles vouchers are not the same as paying me for my professional expertise, because there's a difference between, just lived experience and, being seen as equal contributor. And I think that has to be addressed too.
thank you so much for that feedback, Jenny. It's Mary speaking. Yeah, so that's certainly an important point to clarify for our FAQs as well, and we'll come back and update our FAQs. There's a question, I think I'm right, and someone will tell me if I'm not right. But I think we're up to the question from Uma, which is, I'd like to ask about the representation of migrant and culturally and linguistically diverse disabled community in the assessment panel for this new ground. There are numerous challenges that families within this community face, yet they are underrepresented, and there are few initiatives coming from them due to a lack of exposure and representation. What steps is the panel taking to ensure individuals with lived experience from these communities are included in the process? Additionally, what would be the best way for these communities to get involved and potentially attract such grant opportunities? I might have a first stab at that one, if you like, Gillian. And just wanted to let you know, Uma, and that we're working closely with the National Ethnic Disability Alliance as well. So they're the disability representative organisation for people with disability from culturally linguistic diverse backgrounds. resources, and I hope, I'm not sure if you actually work with that group, or if not, one of the things we like to do is match people up as well. But in terms of the assessment panels, as even though we don't like that word diversity, we are absolutely very conscious that we need to have the diversity of the community and the disability community represented in our assessment processes. So I don't know if there's anything else, Jill, that you'd like to add to that.
Jill speaking. Yeah, thank you. Only to note that in part of the rest of our work plan that isn't just focused on funding research projects, we've got some work that's looking at building system-wide research capacity for disability inclusive research. And absolutely, we need to look at what are the ways that we can create easier access and change the way that things have been done so that they are culturally safe and relevant to broader groups of people. So there will be scholarships and fellowships for people who are wanting to have a career in research that come up. And we really need to think and make conscious decisions to whether it looks like prioritising groups where there's been marginalisation, there's been poor access, there's been all these factors that have made it impossible to be included, that we address those. So I am being non-specific, I guess, but with a commitment for us to learn from who's doing things well in the community. And if we just work according to what's in our research agenda and strategic plan, having a look at who has the least access to safety in the community needs to be considered. We'll do our best to make sure that there's people who are able to look at applications about communities who have community knowledge or community links or understandings as we see the applications come in. Yeah, and the other thing is to say that we want to be transparent about what we've done. So we'll show you our work, and where we've missed things, we'll be inviting suggestions on how to do things better as we move forward for all of our things.
Mary speaking. Thank you very much, Gillian. I'm going to go to Sophie's question, which I accidentally missed, and I'm sorry, Sophie. And then I'll open it up to anyone who wants to put their hands up. I understand, Mary, you've got your hand, Marianne, you've got your hands up. So if you wanted to ask a verbal question and not in the chat, please do put your hand up now. We've probably got time for maybe 2 more questions in addition to this one. They're great questions, as Jill put in the chat. This one was, for criteria 1 on impact on policy, practice or programs, do you mean the impact of the overall research project, i.e. the one that's funded in round 2, or do you mean the impact of the co-design process round 1 funding? And that's a really important question. So Jill, could you answer that one, please?
Yes, also referring back to the guideline too, because we thought about this deeply. The criteria 1 really is about the impact of the issue and the opportunity and the way that you're trying to address that. So it's looking at longer term impact, but I mean, some of that impact might be shorter term. It's not just about the timeline, but the impact of what you're wanting to design and really what you could do in the space. Whereas the criterion 2 is more about the process of co-designing the research proposal, or the process of doing that knowledge synthesis project together in partnerships. And you'll see the dot points in the, oh, here it is, the other side of my desk. It's the assessment criterion 2 is more looking at how the project itself will strengthen the skills of people on the team and others involved. Just a note there, I hope I'm not, no, I think I can say this, not just thinking that people who are trained researchers will be informing the people who aren't trained researchers about how to research, not just in one way, but how will what you're doing together share knowledge both ways, or all of the ways between the members of the team, or, you know, what new skills, what new relationships will you have that make it more likely you can keep doing really useful research in the future, or how you might develop systems and policies and resources locally in a disability representative organisation, for example, that supports more disability-led research in the future. So different to the impact of solving the problem or going ahead with looking at an opportunity to create the safety. Does that make sense? Did I cover that with enough clarity?
Mary speaking. And I think, given this is a question that has come up, it also came up in our drop-in sessions. We'll do some more work on our FAQs as well, from all of the questions today, to make sure not only you have access to the questions after the answer to the question after the session, but also others who maybe couldn't have been here today. It's very important that we share the questions that we've heard today with others who may not have had an opportunity to be here today. Probably got time for one more question before we wrap up. Did anyone want to put their hand up? I'm just checking with Sue. Have I missed any questions?
Sue speaking. Marianne did have her hand up, but it's gone back down. So, and camera's off. So,
I was just gonna say I'm the president of NIDA, so I do work with ethnic communities. So I am here if anybody wants to ask me any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marianne. Great to have you here. All right.
I guess just on that too, the other thing that we are hoping, and thanks so much for offering, Marianne. I'm assuming that your invitation was for us to ask you questions, but also other people who are here. Through getting everyone together, we're not just trying to give you a lecture on what to do to apply for the grants, but give you an opportunity to connect with each other.
Yeah, that'd be great, because we would like to connect with other organisations in the same space. So
Feel free to use the chat, and or if you lose track of each other and would like us to help you make an introduction, you can ask as well. We won't share anyone's details directly, right? But we can certainly ask and support you to connect.
Mary speaking. Well, it's just about time for us to wrap up. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank our captioner and our Auslan interpreters as well. Thank you very much for your work. And thank you all for your interest in this research. And we really are trying to break new ground in terms of flipping research on its head, that it's led by and with people with disabilities. So the types of questions you've asked are the exact types of questions we want to hear. And we will work to update our frequently asked questions from this session. We had a drop-in session on Monday, and I would encourage you, if you've still got more questions, we've got drop-in sessions which are more smaller group sessions where you can also ask your questions as well. So please do come to one of our drop-in sessions if you've got more questions. We're trying to share information as much as we can. And just while I've got the floor, I'd also like to thank our wonderful NDRP team. We've got Sue here on the help. We've got Gillian, who's been answering the questions. I think we've got Sally, our communications lead, on the line, and we've got Natasha as well. We're a small team and we're working very hard, but I'd also like to see, I think I saw some of our research committee members on here as well. And everyone from our board research committee is really working hard to shift the dial on disability-led research. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to engaging with you again in the future.